So hi everybody, welcome to the Visual Studio, DevOps Visual Studio Release Management Jumpstart today. We'll do quick introductions and we'll get started with the content. So my name is Michael Learned. I work as a Senior Premier Field Engineer at Microsoft. Also work as a Visual Studio ALM Ranger. You'll find a lot of our work out on codeplex.com. Work on specifically around the version control guide if you're interested in that, formerly the branching guide. I also work as a partner in the worldwide ALM communities at Microsoft. It's an internal community we have. And I'm with my friend Krithika Sambamurthy.
Hi, Mike.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. I'm Krithika Sambamurthy. I'm a Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft. I focus on Team Foundation Server and Visual Studio as well, helping Premier customers with ALM implementation, Team Foundation Server implementation. I'm also a Visual Studio ALM Ranger, and we work on different projects over there.
Yeah, and so kind of our background with release management and DevOps, we've also worked with customers doing implementations recently around release management specifically, aka in-release or formerly known as in-release. So we've ran into, I'd say, several different things that we're gonna show everybody today in terms of implementing the tool.
Right, we want to show real-world scenarios here.
Yep. So what I'm going to do is do a quick set the table, set expectations, what we're into here. So our target audience really could be anybody. If you're interested in releasing software, then we have something for you here. Prerequisites, we really don't have any. If you have some working knowledge of TFS or Visual Studio, then that's great. But if you don't, we're going to kind of start from the very beginning and take you through this from A to Z, so to speak.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So let's go over the course topics quickly here. So just to keep in mind, these topics are, they come from a workshop that we're in the middle of building, really. And we fit this into like a one-day event, but it's very much, it could be a 3-day event, and all these topics have their own deep dive. We're going to talk about ALM very high level here at the beginning. We're going to do a DevOps overview. Krithika will talk a little bit about DevOps as well. We'll do some release management architecture, and in that one we're going to get into actually installing the tool, right?
Yep, installing and deploying release management from scratch.
Yep, so if you don't have anything today, we're going to take you through all the gotchas and the scenarios. What's really interesting about this, we're pretty excited to do this today, we're going to break a lot of stuff.
Yep, you're going to see a lot of errors.
Yeah, it's software, right? We're going to break it. And we've been breaking it a lot, both in the lab, at customer sites, and with any type of software. Obviously, you're only into it once you start breaking things. Labs only take you so far, right, in a sandbox. So I think, keep in mind as we walk through this that some of the stuff I think we'll purposely break, and then we may have a few fire drills as well that we put out. We've been putting them out since last night even. So
we want to show you some of the common issues and ways to really fix them.
Yep, so there's some big things in Module 2 which we'll get into there, and really throughout our day we'll look at this, as I think that's the most important thing for people that are out there today watching this or watching it on demand later, is we want to save you time and energy as you run into stuff doing the implementation for the tool. So also when we're going to build release pipelines, I mean the name of the game is to set up in Module 3, set up a release pipeline. We're talking about going from a development environment through QA, through production, and you may have many more stages. We'll take you through all the nuts and bolts of that. And then we'll get into Module 4. And Module 4, we're going to take that into maybe like 2 modules or maybe 2 sessions, 2 50-minute sessions, deployment recipes, right?
It's going to be demo heavy. You're going to be showing different deployment recipes, deploying web, deploying SQL, so on and so forth. Yeah, so we're going to get into a bunch of common scenarios, things that you're going to deploy around IIS, SQL Server, SSDT. Once again, there's a lot of interesting things we can do there. And then finally in Module 5, which is going to be really cool, is we're going to show you some advanced topics, namely around multiple domain scenarios, this kind of thing, because it's one thing to run all of this on like one VM. Perhaps you have Brian Keller's VM, and that's a great way to get started. Download that public VM that we provide, and test the labs out. As soon as you introduce a second virtual machine into the equation, which you're going to have in the real world, you're going to have many production environments, many test environments where you're going to have many servers involved. That's where you start to run into some interesting scenarios. Yep, lots of troubleshooting there. Lots of troubleshooting. So we'll talk about scenarios and how to work around some of that stuff as we go as well. So, let me go back to, I think we're on the right side here. We're going to do a quick overview here of Visual Studio ALM and DevOps. This first module is going to be a little more PowerPoint heavy, I would say, as well. We have very little PowerPoint to show you overall today. We'll be much more into demo, just walking around and having a general conversation about what we're doing here.
Okay, so quick overview of what we're going to do to get started. We're going to talk a little bit about ALM, so I assume a lot of you already know a lot about ALM, and if not, there's a lot of great topics already that are out there for ALM. And we're going to talk about DevOps as well. You know, DevOps has been an exciting movement, if you will, since around a few years now, so we'll talk a little bit about what that means. We'll also talk about, of course, release management. That's why we're here. We're going to talk about the tool that is, AKA InRelease, and we're going to be in that tool all day as we work through this stuff. So let's quickly talk about Visual Studio ALM, and I'll say one more time, you can go out and find a litany of different videos and presentations on this particular topic. Microsoft, since 2005, we had something called Team System, where we have a lot of services for building software, basically. So everything from your project management capabilities to the build automation that's here, testing, debugging your code, all centered around Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server. Been around a long time, and the services continue to improve, evolve. We now have services running out in the cloud with things like Visual Studio Online, and there's a lot here. The name of the game is to build and release software. We're going to focus today on that release side, or that delivery side of the ALM spectrum, if you will, and talk a little bit about DevOps and how come it's so important to have this release tool built into our picture here for the first time, which is relatively new here. Keep in mind, we'll show you some stuff today because it's just natural as you're demoing the product to work with things like the build system, to work with some things like version control. But that's not our focus here necessarily. So we're assuming a little bit of that knowledge already. If not, we'll ask you to kind of deep dive on that on your own a little bit further. But we'll pretty much explain things as we do them, and we'll abstract some of the stuff away that you don't need to know about. So we'll go ahead and talk a few trends here that we see with application development. So first of all, we all know there's cloud services being developed constantly. There are very user-centric is the name of the game here. The user experience is huge. Social applications and being able to run on any device are all big trends. And what this is driving is, or helping to drive, is a lot of interesting things that end up coming back down into the tooling. I mean, we have to do continuous delivery at the end of the day, or be delivering all the time or releasing all the time, not only to fix bugs or fix defects potentially, but to deliver new features, new capabilities in the products constantly to compete. So and it really doesn't matter what type of organization you are anymore, you're going to need to be doing some type of continuous delivery. Customers just expect it, whoever your customer is, internal or external, right? So in the case of Microsoft even, you see a lot of this with our products. From our operating system, of course, with our ALM tools with Visual Studio and our quarterly updates. We're doing releases every 3-4 weeks out in the cloud for our online service.
Yep, you no longer have a big bang release, so to speak.
No longer are we waiting a year or 2 years or even months anymore. And in the case of some really extreme examples with some of our partners and competitors, they could be releasing many times a minute even. So it's really getting important to really to drive a very repeatable release process. And that's what this is really all about is we need first-class tooling and processes and roles in this process to do releases, because it's no longer happening so infrequently. It's no longer happening once in a blue moon. It's happening every day all the time, right? So we'll go ahead and look at a few more slides here. So this is just a slide that talks about kind of what we're doing, which is to build, measure, learn. And it's a continuous flow where you might have said 10, 15 years ago, you spent a lot of time in the planning phase and you were kind of done in the planning phase. You spent a lot of time in the development phase and you were kind of done in the development phase. And then eventually, like you said, you released a big bang and you were kind of done. So if a kind of waterfall kind of stream, it's no longer that, right? We're in these phases simultaneously. We're in these phases all the time, including the release phase. All right, so we'll quickly talk a little bit about the DevOps movement, and I know you want to speak a few words about
Sure.
interest here.
Yeah, so DevOps really seems to be the buzzword these days. You hear about it every time. Hashtag DevOps even shows up on Twitter from time to time, right?
Like trends on Twitter, yes.
Exactly. So people keep talking about it. DevOps, it's really not a group. It's not a team. It's not a role. It's really a cultural movement, if you will, for tighter collaboration between developers and operations. You have these two different teams working in silo all the time. So DevOps really it's looking for tighter collaboration between those two teams, right? You want them to talk to each other on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah. So basically, the DevOps, the word itself is getting a lot of press. I think if we looked at a history of DevOps in Wikipedia, it'll talk about in 2009 it starts to take shape in blogs. I know we talk to a lot of people that'll say this is nothing new at all, right? This has been around forever.
It's just a new term, right?
It's just a new term for the same thing, and you're trying to improve collaboration. I would say at least it's becoming very visible, and it's driving a lot of things, this movement. And everything from DevOps.com is a website you can visit out there. It's got a lot of interesting news, Microsoft, non-Microsoft news as well out there. In terms of a lot of the vendors, really everybody in the world's talking about DevOps, of course. And it certainly is, when somebody says, well, is there tooling centered around DevOps? I mean, certainly tooling is very important. We must have first-class tools to kind of enable a lot of these things we want to do with automation and moving releases via approval workflows and all of that. But it's just as much a culture shift or a mindset than it is anything else.
Yeah, it's a combination of people, processes, and tools.
Yep, people, processes, and tools all kind of working together. And if we talk a little bit about the history of our tool, Team System, or formerly known as Team System, way back in 2005, all the way now what we'll say is Visual Studio ALM, right, which also implies we're using Team Foundation Server. It's been very interesting evolution. Really, since the beginning, we've had the concept of a build automation system, and that system's improved over time. I mean, we had everything where we're kind of managing the code and source control of, again, using a work item tracking system to kind of track our work, and then eventually build the code. And building the code has several benefits. I mean, we're creating outputs that we're going to eventually probably release or deploy. We're also building the code to do continuous integration, very, very important. But kind of what we've lacked until today out of the box was the concept of a first-class release citizen or release tool. And, this is why, around last summer or so, we announced we acquire InRelease from InCycle. And this kind of fills a gap for us. I mean, our tool very much was about creating the outputs, and then we were kind of done at that point.
Yeah, prior to the 2013 version, we didn't have an out-of-the-box solution for deployment or for releases.
Right. So what we did then to do deployment, and you may still be doing this today if you're using TFS, either a previous version to 2013, or if you're even using 2013, customers are still today using some type of a customized process to do the delivery. So there's a few of those I want to mention. So it's very common to see a build process, for example, customized to do things like also deploy to the database. It's very common to see it, or to deploy to the website, whatever you happen to be packaging, creating your MSIs. So not only is it building to produce automation and produce the artifacts, it now also is doing deployments. And that's a little bit hokey because you're tying up your build system, obviously, to, your build system's very busy anyway, and you're making it do one more thing. And then what you find is it's not really standardized. I mean, I end up creating a lot of custom widgets and things to make that happen. There are various approaches, and there's good practices for allowing the build system to do some of those things, but we don't really get nice visibility into what's happening. Of course, we don't get any type of traceability or repeatability, if you will, via the process. We'll look at some of the things that the InRelease tool or release management now, as we're branding everything, now that it does for us. So keep in mind, you're liable to find a lot of custom things out there today, depending on what organization you're looking at. And even inside of an enterprise, we see lots of different things happening on different teams even to do deployments. One common thing, or kind of semi-popular thing, I would say, that with one of my customers was to use something called TFS Deployer, which would be a third-party or a Codeplex tool that basically looked at build qualities, and it would look at those and execute PowerShell scripts and do deployment. So it kind of a step in the right direction, maybe for continuous delivery, and that at least it wasn't using the heavy hitter in the build system to do all the work, and it could key in on qualities that you would toggle and then execute something. But that therein lies the problem, really, is there's so many different ways to deploy because we had no OOB solution, right, that everybody was doing a little bit of everything. So this gives us a great place to start. And we encourage everybody, I think, after watching this to maybe adopt this as your tool of choice. We're going to continue to evolve this tool as we move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about continuous delivery here in general. So again, if you see this slide, I think in various Microsoft presentations that are happening out there, you see on the top left, we've got a planning area there where it's all about agile portfolio management in the new version and really looking at the portfolio of work that you have. We're doing a lot of stuff with the Kanban movement, of course.
We've been adding a lot of new features in each one of those areas lately.
Yep, new features you'll find in 2013 to support more and more cool stuff for planning the work out, right? Or setting up the work inside of the product itself. And I really love what formerly known as Team Web Access. We'll call it the web portal now. Very rich HTML5 client that basically lets us sit there in a very modern user experience, which we talk about is so important. Set up my work, set up my area, set up my sprints, plan out my capacity for my teams, on and on and on. And we can use that tool, to kind of create all the requirements and manage our backlogs at the end of the day. Then on the bottom left of my deck here, I've got the develop area. We continue to do some great stuff in the development space, or for developers, if you will, adding things like Git into the story now, right, for TFS.
Yeah, in 2013, yep.
Yeah, 2013 on-premise. We first originated some of this stuff in the cloud via our Visual Studio Online offering there. Of course, we've got a bunch of other stuff that we're doing that's really interesting to the software development process, like allowing you to do things like load testing as a service. Load testing used to be really heavy to set up and it's very kind of hard to approach. Now we're doing that very nicely here using the cloud, the benefits of the cloud. And then over on the right-hand side is where we're going to kind of be focusing our energy today, in the operation space. So we've added more integration with things like System Center, being able to tie those two teams again, helping DevOps by being able to have operations, monitor, collect IntelliTrace data, get that to my development teams in the form of a work item. Lots of examples here of this kind of thing. And the bottom right, where we're going to spend, all of our day today, is the release side. You think about it, if you do all these really great things with your tool and your people and your processes, such as you plan your work and you've got terrific developers using first-class tooling and you've got nice operations happening as well, but you can't release the software, then you're really at a disadvantage, right? If you get all the way to the end and you can't release, or you release with errors, or it's very non-repeatable, or it's very unique, you've been releasing the dev and test over and over again continuously, all that's working very well. But when you get all the way to production, it's a big roadblock, then you're only so agile at that point, right? And it's going to become a big problem. Yep, so we're going to focus on the release side, talk about the integrated capabilities of the release management tool, and let us, again, enable continuous delivery, which again is maybe a little bit of an overused word, but to deliver all the time software, by having something out of the box with Team Foundation Server is super, super critical, super important to software development moving forward. So, and I think you'll see as we continue to evolve the tool itself, like we do all the other capabilities in Visual Studio ALM, it can only get better from here, right? So.
Yep, with the introduction of release management for Visual Studio.
Yep. So we're going to go ahead and talk a few challenges here for releasing software, and then eventually I'll set up kind of what we're doing in our environment and how we're going to continue on the show here.
Okay.
So challenges releasing software. I mean, you guys probably feel some of these pains today. Again, this has been in several presentations, and there's nothing brand new here. One of the huge challenges is just that it's manual. So at the end of the day, if you're doing things that are manual all the time, it takes time, right? And time is our most precious commodity, as we all know. So if you're doing manual activities, how do we automate those? And are they worth automating? And again, Kritika mentioned earlier that the idea of a big bang release. And if you think about it, when we used to release things very infrequently, so you would release things, once every 6 months, once every 3 months, once or twice a year, depending on a product. Then maybe automating some of that wasn't so important. What you did instead was you grabbed a bunch of pizza coupons and you set up all weekend long and you paid some overtime and you got it done, and it was painful. There was some pizza money involved and this kind of thing, but it happened once every blue moon, so it was no big deal. No reason to automate it. The cost of automating it, just like anything else, maybe was more expensive than than it was worth. So there wasn't the ROI there. But now in the world that we've been talking about, which is we're not releasing like that anymore. We're continuously delivering something, bug fixes, features. In our case of Visual Studio Online, or formerly known as Team Foundation Service, aka TFS running in Azure, and I can keep going. it's releasing every 3-4 weeks or so. Even that's a lot. That's much more frequent than we used to have updates for. So it's important that those processes are automated at that point, that it's not a manual thing. We don't have the luxury of an all-weekend thing, and certainly there are more extreme scenarios depending on the products where you may be releasing once a day, right, or many times a minute in some really extreme scenarios. You must have very automated processes at that point that are, not manual, introduces error-prone stuff, this kind of thing as well.
The idea is also to make it repeatable.
Yeah, you want to be repeatable, right? So I want to trust it.
Right.
I want to trust it. So when I go to production, the second time, it's just like it happened before, and I trust it, right? One common thing is to see, and we work with customers in the field, is there are some really cool things they do in the development environments or the test environments. Almost like until you get to a certain stage of the pipeline. And that's where, we hand that off to this other team. And,
you don't have any visibility.
Yeah, we don't kind of know what's going on from that point. We practice the heck out of releasing. Yeah, we release once a day to the dev environment, right, over and over again. And, and maybe it's not the best thing always. Like they might be using Visual Studio, not even relying on Teambuild, but it's very repeatable. They've proved that it works over and over. But when it goes to production, it's a completely different process. So you're kind of on the wrong track, where as if you have multiple different processes, possibly documentation, people involved in the process at different areas of the pipeline. It's okay to have some of those variants, but if it's completely radically different by the time when you go to prod, then it's not going to be tested and it's not going to be repeated. So what we want to do is set up a pipeline in release management, test it over and over again in all the environments that we're going to use, and eventually to prod as well.
Right.
Nothing will force us there with the tool. We're not saying that you can't have some different things happen, by the time you get to prod. Obviously, you're protecting prod. It's the blessed ground. It's the holy ground. And you want to, if you want, have certain, lockdown restrictions there. But as close as you can get some of your pre-environments, your staging environments to prod, so that kind of resembles prod, then the better you will be. So the more you can test, right? So, coordination between developers, operation, and stakeholders is very difficult. It's my third bullet in my PowerPoint deck there. And this is the big reason why DevOps, because what you'll find is developers, again, can communicate with one another at a certain level pretty well. Yeah. They can communicate with the testers sometimes relatively well. And then operations can be some walls there. And there's some reasons why for this. There's some classic definitions why maybe operations teams or maybe classic IT and your development people might be a little bit at odds. One example I like is the fact that developers are really getting rewarded today for the amount of features and things they deliver. The change they create might be very directly related to their paycheck.
Yeah, the operations team is different.
Operations team very different, because operations team wants to be like, okay, I want to keep things up.
Keep the lights on, so to speak.
Keep the lights on, keep things stable, and you want to give me change, right? You want to give me change. I want to keep things up. Those things don't play very well. I want to minimize change, right? Because it's unknown to me. So breaking down some of these barriers and where we can start to trust each other is what DevOps is all about. And again, tools can only take us part of the way there. It also has to be a culture. We've seen lots of cultures out there that are just, no way we're automating things to production. This is the way we do it. And we got to be careful, I think, as organizations as well, to not just do things because that's the way we did them before. We can lose sight of the fact that why we're doing them to begin with. We did things because we did it 10 years ago this way, and Bob said it was the way we should do it. And Bob knew everything, right? And Bob was very smart. Well, where's Bob today? Well, Bob's been gone forever. He's retired. He's fishing somewhere. But we still continue on the thing. Well, times have changed, so maybe just reevaluate some of your processes, some of your documentation. I encourage you to see if it still makes sense, because it's very common to see things that we just continue to do. We're not sure why we do them anymore, right? And you're on the wrong path if you're just doing things to release software and you can't explain why, right? We need to yank those things out of the process there. So we hope to continue to evolve this DevOps movement, this DevOps story by introducing better and better tooling, better and better best practices. There's lots of different ways kind of to skin the same cat. Apologize to the cat lovers out there. But there's always different ways to do things, and necessarily a best practice for something. But the closer we can get to some of this stuff, the better.
And that's what we're going to be doing the next couple of hours.
Yep. So what we're going to do right now is, I think that's probably our last slide in this deck. Well, there's the history, which I already told you. I'm sorry about that. I told you about the history. There's been no out-of-the-box solution here necessarily, other than some custom stuff here. And then we acquired the product here from June 2013. You can go out and read those press releases. And again, if you're not familiar, if you're on a prior version of Visual Studio ALM, I encourage everybody, get to the new version of Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server and take advantage of a lot of what we're going to show you. Now, in release management will work with prior versions of TFS as well, so you have some flexibility there. But hopefully come to the new version and get all the benefits here that we're going to show you. So a couple more things. Real quick overview of what release management does before I'll go to demos. And then I promise we're probably most of the day going to be in demos. We have a little bit of PowerPoint to set the table on things, but mainly we'll be in demos. So release management. So we've talked a little bit about it. Kritika, you want to explain a little bit about what we do with release management here?
Sure. So we use release management to create or define your release paths, release pipelines, and release templates. So you see that there's also approval workflows that come around with it. It helps you automate your deployments to different environments. Again, the whole point here is to create a repeatable way of deploying to different environments.
So if it's manual, I can't do it repeatable very well, right? Because you don't trust me.
Exactly. So I trust you, but that's the point, right?
Well, we'll see today. You won't be able to trust me, right? I'll do some manual stuff and it'll break. So yeah.
Yeah, we'll see things break today.
Yeah.
It also gives you full traceability. So if I go back to the slide here, you'll see that it provides me with visibility and full traceability throughout the process. So if my project manager wants to see what got released in dev versus QA versus prod, you have that nice visibility available.
Yeah, so we start to get some visuals on where things are, and I think we're going to continue to evolve this part of the product. But today in the client tool that we'll look at, we can kind of see where things are at. In the browser, I can look at the various stages, and I can impact those things manually if I need to.
Yep.
And I love the second bullet we have, the define approval workflows. If we think about just that one for a moment, if you think about no matter what you're doing today, if you're customizing your build process and you say, heck, I'm all the way automated, that's really cool already via the build system, why would I do this? A project manager is not involved using the automated build system and doing deployments, right? Your business analyst is not involved. Your stakeholder is not involved. I love the fact that I can have a non-developer just press a button in a browser and then have them do the deployment to production without me intervening at all as a developer.
Yeah, they don't even have to be in the tool.
They don't even have to be, yeah, exactly. There's nothing other than a web browser needed in some cases. And maybe you say, well, that's a little bit crazy for production because of the way we do things in our org. Well, that's fine. But is there a QA environment maybe where do you really need to wait on a developer or a tester or some other person? I mean, you'll define those rules, and if you need to, okay. But if you can just have, your stakeholder might be very interested in saying, no, I'm going to approve that, and we'll look at that. And they can do an approval there in a browser and then move those bits up the chain there.
And we'll also talk about automating the approval process.
Yeah, so we can also, have it, if we want to have it on full autopilot, we can do that, and then somewhere in between, maybe automatic, and have somebody intervene and say, you know what, I need to make sure that I press a button. Okay, you can do that too. So you have some flexibility here. Yep. And, the more requirements you have around security, maybe at certain stages of the pipeline you require more, we have those capabilities in the tool. More or less automated, if I'm going to dev and QA, I can do all that, do that all day. You can still use your build system, as we'll see. We can still initiate releases from a build.
There's nice integration available with Team Foundation Server.
Yep, so if we want to integrate with the build system and say, okay, I'm going to kick a build off at midnight tonight, and I want that to also kick off a release if everything goes well, you can do those kinds of things. But it's really nice because we'll decouple the build agent from the release part of the process. It'll call into the APIs for the release management server, and then it will end up getting the release kicked off, and that build can go back to doing what it does best. So again, we'll look at all this in more detail here. So I'm going to move over to a demo here, and I'm going to go ahead, I think we're good on my screen here, what I'm demoing, moving out of PowerPoint. So I'm just out in Azure right now, and I want to kind of explain, Kritika, I'm going to go ahead and explain and set the table for the environment that we're using today for the all of our demos that we're going to do. And you guys at home can certainly be working along with us in real time. You can watch us later, obviously, and go through some of this. And again, we talked about at the beginning, we're assuming nothing here in terms of knowledge. So some of this stuff, if you're already very fluent and been using the tool for a year, it may be a little bit too light for you. We'll be getting into some other concepts that may be a little too deep, depending on where you're at with the tool. But I want to set the table of how we're going to do it. And really, I'm going to rely on Azure to do everything, right? Yes, I can rely on Azure for everything in the world today, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I don't have anything local on this machine. There's no magic here. I've got all my stuff running out in virtual machines, so our Azure IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service story, and just quickly show you a little bit about what we're going to be doing. It'll make sense as we're bouncing around things. So I said we're going to start from scratch, Kritika. I told the audience here that it didn't matter if they didn't know anything, we'd set it up. And I'm relying on you for a lot of that, by the way.
Oh, yeah, for the installation, yep.
Yeah, and we were up at like midnight last night still doing this. So
running the midnight oil.
Yeah, okay. We've done it one time, I think, at least? Okay.
A couple times.
A couple times.
Okay, so pretty good about it.
Now, I'm saying that, so we've got a couple things. We have an MVA, VSALM virtual machine running. And it's going to be where we have Team Foundation Server installed, where we have Team Build installed. We also have the Release Management Server installed. So if you're familiar with like a single VM setup, with like a Brian Keller VHD setup, that's what this particular guy is here. And it doesn't really have anything. It has TFS already on it, so we're not going to install TFS. We're not going to install Visual Studio.
We'll start with Release Management Server, yeah.
We'll start with Release Management, what I mean by starting from scratch. So we'll take some shortcuts, we just have to, right? And then we'll build from there inside of a single VHD, and we'll just build through that world until we're releasing software at some point, okay? Now, we eventually are going to move out into a more sophisticated setup, and really you can simulate a lot of things with just two VMs. You have your one all-in-one box that has TFS, Release Management Server, all of this, and then you introduce the second thing, which is our deployment agent, right? And we end up with an environment where you want to deploy to as a secondary VM, and that'll make a lot of interesting conversation. We'll run into plenty of stuff, especially when they're not part of the same domain, okay? And I want to everybody keep in mind, we're inside the same cloud service, if you're familiar with Azure. That just kind of means that we're inside the same container. So our VMs can talk to one another, but we're not relying on a domain, which really would be easier if we had a domain in many regards. But we're not trusting the deployment agents, not trusting with the domain trust or anything like this, because we want to show some of the stuff you'll run into. It's very common for customers to say, tool's great, but look, where I need to deploy to doesn't live anywhere near TFS in terms of a domain trust. Doesn't live anywhere near the Release Management Server. So we're going to show you some of that as we go out throughout later in the day. So we'll start kind of small, inside of a single VM, go through all the core concepts, and abstracting away the noise of like a big world, and then we'll get into something fancier as we go. Now, I trust Kritika. She's really good at a lot of this stuff, but I had to have a backup, right? So we already have two other things running. I just want to point out what they are if you see me bouncing in and out of the portal today. We have the something called ALM Data 1, and we have something called the Web SQL environment. And again, this is kind of the all-in-one TFS Release Management Server box. This is my secondary agent. The difference here is, from what Kritika is going to start with, is I already have all this stuff working. Yep. Well, most of it's all working, right? So I've already done deployments, already configured things. So if we were to run into any trouble setting things up from scratch live, since we're not doing a pre-recorded event, then we won't be able to work around that. So we've got some fail-safe here. And we may just step into some of that anyway, depending on our time today, how much time we have to show you stuff. So this is kind of our environment in a nutshell. We'll be using remote desktop a lot to go to this. Now, nothing would be stopping you, though, from, if you didn't have an Azure subscription, if you didn't have an Azure account, you could certainly have this stuff running locally, either on physical hardware, virtual machines, on Hyper-V, or any number of ways. And again, I keep plugging it, but there's already a VHD publicly available for free that you can practice stuff on, that you can download from Brian Keller. If you was to just do a quick search for Brian Keller VHD, you'll find all kinds of noise there. One other thing I'll point out, if you don't worry about my credit status too much, I noticed I'm down to $13 because of all the stuff I've been sharing with Kritika here. Budgets are tough right now. No, kidding. I got my wife's Christina, her credit card is in the account here safely, so we'll be fine. Azure's great because it's going to charge just for what I use, and I'm comfortable we won't run over too much. It won't even be a blip on her radar. She won't be able to find out what we did, so we're good. I just want to point that out because it is yellow up there and it might be scaring some people. Okay, so I'm going to quickly, and we'll take a break here shortly, and then we'll come back with the fresh install.
Yep, installation and configuration of release management.
Yeah, you're going to go ahead and start installing here shortly, and we'll show most of that in real time. We'll take a few fast-forward shortcuts just for the sake of time. Quickly, just want to go ahead and bounce over to one of the, I told you I had something, Kritika, that was already working, and that's the tool here. And I'm just going to give a quick lap around a couple other things that we have in terms of Visual Studio and TFS. Now, this is all about release management today, aka InRelease, the tool that we purchased at Microsoft that we're integrating now more and more into the product. It's all about the release management tool. That's why we're installing that. But and it doesn't have to use Team Foundation Server, right?
Yeah, there's no requirement for Team Foundation Server, really.
Okay, so you're telling me I could use some other system and we would get the benefits of using release management. But if I've got Visual Studio and TFS, which I'm assuming a large portion of our audience does.
Yep, I'm going to be able to let my build kick off the release. That's one benefit. I can also integrate with TFS to get the groups that we have set up in TFS for security purposes. Okay,
so you're going to be able to integrate with TFS, use security, you're going to be able to use the build system, and all that makes a lot of sense. So one of the beauties of our product, or the Visual Studio ALM and TFS product, is the fact that we have all this stuff integrated very nicely.
Yep.
And so if you happen to be using the other tools to do some of your processes, maybe you have a different build system, right? You have something that's creating the outputs in some way. You can still use release management. Now, that being said, we're going to use Visual Studio and TFS today. Now, I've already on our VMs here have Visual Studio installed. So you see like a Team Explorer here where I've got various builds running. We're not going to show everything from scratch. I've got some projects that are already created. We may create like a new database project or do some basic stuff like that. We're going to keep an eye on time. Again, we're showing you a lot of this for the first time in this format. So if we run out of time on certain areas, we'll make judgment calls and assume some knowledge, like in Visual Studio and TFS. But I just want to point that out. There's nothing, not trying to hide anything behind the curtain. I've got a team project here. We have TFS that's up and running, right? We have a Team Foundation server. And we have a couple team projects that live underneath this, what is it? Our ALM Data 1 is the name of our server here. And we've got a couple team projects that we'll be working with here. We also have automated build system. Team Build is installed here.
On the same box.
So Team Build itself is installed here on the same node. In your world, in the real world, in any type of size of an organization or project, you may have this, first of all. You could have a single server and it'll work, depending on the size of hardware and all that. But you'll likely have your build system on dedicated machines. You'll have TFS on dedicated machines.
And release management server even on a dedicated machine.
Release management server, I would say the typical scenario is it's going to live on a dedicated machine. So none of that should matter much, though. We'll talk about the nuances of when it will. I mean, it certainly does. I talked about like when the deployment agent lives on separate machines and doesn't trust and things like that. It's very important. But you can just kind of take a leap of faith that if you guys already have a very distributed TFS setup, or it's multiple machines, don't worry about that for our presentation here. It's all going to kind of work the same. There's a few nuances, like when you have a build system installed, out somewhere in the wild on a dedicated machine, you also install like the release management client on that dedicated build system to get the things to talk.
That's a requirement, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas in our case, since the build system's on the same machine as the app tier, then we'll go ahead and we'll get away with it because we're going to put the client on anyway, and we don't run into that kind of thing. So again, we'll point out stuff like that. I know you're going to point out something when we have, I believe, SharePoint.
Yeah, so we'll run into an issue, which will be shown in the demo here, when we install Release Management Server with a box that has SharePoint Foundation 2013 installed. So yeah.
Yep. Okay, so, and we'll show how to work around that. So if you do have a single server install and maybe you pull your hair out from, either just trying to test at home or, again, a small team, all they need is one node maybe. There's a bug there you might run into. We'll show how that looks. So that's pretty much it in terms of our setup and how we have our stuff configured. We'll explain it all as more as we go. The last thing I will say is we'll be in some other areas like IIS doing some things. We'll be in SQL Server a little bit doing some things, because we want to show you some common scenarios, and it just requires some knowledge in all these tools. So if you've never seen SQL Server before, but if you've never seen IIS before, then some of this might be a little bit crazy to look at initially, but we'll kind of explain what we're doing, which in essence is, creating app pools, creating websites, and doing some things like that. Keep in mind with this product that really it's really very limitless in what you could do, what you could deploy. We have a bunch of stuff we'll look at kind of that's out of the box, and there's very classic stuff.
Yep, classic IIS stuff, SQL stuff, out of the box with Release Management Server. And then the nice thing about Release Management Server is it's highly extensible. I can customize it.
Okay, so right, you can build your own actions, your own tools. So if deploying your software is a little bit different, if we don't provide something out of the box for you, there are ways to go ahead and have that deploy. Now again, as you imagine, you can go down to things like PowerShell and executables. If it can run inside of a Windows process, you can probably execute it and get something to happen as part of the process. There's interesting things that we won't have time to look at today that are out of the box. So for example, if you're a reporting services developer and you want to deploy a reporting services report, we've already got that reporting services deployer there set up for you. We will look at DAC packs, from SQL Server Data Tools. We will look at some web stuff there as well. There's things like imagine that you want to run automated tests as part of your deployment. We won't look at that, but that's here. We'll have a peek at kind of what's in the inventory for all this stuff. We won't be able to do all of it today, but hopefully this gets you off the ground, gets you started running with the tooling, and then you can, in your particular scenario, whatever your software looks like, either use something that's already built there for you, or customize something, build something yourself in terms of a tool component, and we'll look and see how that works. So, to wrap this particular module, we're not going to require any prerequisites to go to the next one. Hopefully, everybody has a very kind of high-level understanding of what DevOps is, what release management will do, and then I think by the end of the next module we have, you'll understand how to get it off the ground, get it up, get it configured, and then we'll move on from there.
Sounds good.
Okay.